The Light of the Western Stars by Zane Grey. Chapter 1. A Gentleman on the Range. When Madeline Hammond stepped from the train at El Cogno, New Mexico, it was nearly midnight, and her first impression was of a huge dark space of cool, windy emptiness, strange and silent, stretching away under great blinking white stars.
"Miss, there's no one to meet you,"
said the conductor rather anxiously.
"I wired my brother," she replied. "The train being so late, perhaps he grew tired of waiting. He'll be here presently, but if he should not come, will I find a hotel?"
"There's lodging to be had. Get the stage agent to show you. Now, if you'll excuse me, this is no place for a lady like you to be alone at night. It's a rough little town, mostly Mexicans, miners, and cowboys, and they kind of carouse a lot. Besides, the revolution across the border has stirred up some excitement along the line. Miss, I guess it's safe enough if you—"
"Thank you. I'm not in the least afraid."
As the train started to glide away, Miss Hammond walked towards the dimly lit station. As she was about to enter, she encountered a Mexican with sombrero hiding his features and a blanket mantling his shoulders.
"Is there anyone here to meet Miss Hammond?" she asked.
"No, señorita."
He replied from under the muffled blanket, and he shuffled away into the shadow. She entered the empty waiting room. An oil lamp gave out a thick yellow light. The ticket window was open, and through it she saw there was neither agent nor operator in the little compartment. A telegraph instrument clicked faintly. Madeline Hammond stood tapping a shapely foot on the floor, and with some amusement contrasted her reception in El Cajon with what it was when she left the train at the Grand Central. The only time she could remember ever having been alone like this was once when she had missed her maid and her train at a place outside of Versailles. An adventure that had been a novel and a delightful break in the prescribed routine of her much chaperoned life. She crossed the waiting room to the window and, holding aside her veil, looked out. At first she could descry only a few dim lights, and those blurred in her sight. As her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, she saw a superbly built horse standing near the window. Beyond was a bare square, or if it was a street, it was the widest one Madeline had ever seen. The dim lights shone from low, flat buildings. She made out the dark shapes of many horses, all standing motionless with a drooping head. Through a hole in the window glass came a cool breeze, and on it breathed a sound that struck coarsely upon her ear, a discordant mingling of laughter and shouting and the tramping of boots to the hard music of a phonograph.
"Western revelry," mused Miss Hammond as she left the window. "Now, what to do? I'll wait here, I guess. Perhaps the station agent will return soon, or Alfred will come for me."
As she sat down to wait, she reviewed the cause with which accounted for the remarkable situation in which she found herself. That Madeline Hammond should be alone, at a late hour, in a dingy little western railroad station was indeed extraordinary. The close of her debutant year had been marred by the only unhappy experience of her life, the disgrace of her brother and his leaving home. She dated the beginning of the certain thoughtful habit of mind from that time, and a dissatisfaction with the brilliant life society offered her. The change had been so gradual that it was permanent before she realized it. For a while, an active outdoor life, golf, tennis, yachting, kept this realization from becoming a morbid introspection. There came a time when even those lost charm for her, and then she believed she was indeed ill in mind. Travel did not help neither. There had been months of unrest, of curiously painful wonderment that her position, her wealth, her popularity no longer sufficed. She believed she had lived through the dreams and fancies of a girl to become a woman of the world, and she had gone on as before, a part of the glittering show, but no longer blind to the truth, that there was nothing in her luxurious life to make it significant. Something from the depths of her there flashed up at odd moments intimation of a future revolt. She remembered one evening at the opera when the curtain was rising upon a particularly well-done piece of stage scenery, a broad space of deep desolation, reaching away under an infinite of night sky, illuminated by stars. The suggestion it brought of vast waste of lonely rugged earth, of a great blue arching vault of starry sky, pervaded her soul with a strange, sweet peace. When the scene was changed, she lost this vague new sense of peace, and she turned away from the stage in irritation. She looked at the long, curved tier of glittering boxes that represented her world. It was a distinguished and splendid world, the wealth, fashion, culture, beauty, and blood of a nation. She, Madeline Hammond, was part of it. She smiled, she listened, she talked to the men who from time to time strolled into the Hammond box, and she felt that there was no moment when she was natural, true to herself. She wondered why these people should not somehow, some way be different, but she could not tell what she wanted them to be. If they had been different, they would not have fit into the place. Indeed, they would not have been there at all. Yet she thought wistfully that they lacked something for her. And suddenly realizing she would marry one of these men, if she did not revolt, she was assailed by a great weariness, an icy, strange sense that life had paled upon her. She was tired of fashionable society. She was tired of polished, imperturbable men who sought only to please her. She was tired of being feted and admired, loved and followed, tired of people, tired of houses, noise, ostration, and luxury. She was so tired of herself. In the lonely distances and the passionless stars of bold paintings, stage sceneries, she had caught a glimpse of something that stirred her soul. The feeling did not last. She could not call it back. She imagined that the very boldness of the scene had appealed to her. She divined that the man who painted it had found inspiration, joy, strength, serenity in rugged nature. And at last she knew what she needed. To be alone, to brood for long hours, to gaze out on lonely, silent, darkened stretches, to watch the stars, to face her soul, to find her real self. And then it was she had at first thought of visiting the brother with who had gone west to cast his fortune with the cattlemen. As it happened, she had friends who were on the eve of starting for California, and she made a quick decision to travel with them. When she calmly announced her intent of going out west, her mother had exclaimed in consternation, and her father, surprised into a pathetic memory of the black sheep of the family, had stared at her with glistening eyes.
"Why, Madeline, you want to see that wild boy?"
And then he reverted to the anger he still felt for his wayward son, and he had forbidden Madeline to go. Her mother forgot her haughty poise and dignity. Madeline, however, had exhibited a will she had never before known to possess. She stood her ground even to remind them that now she was 24 and her own mistress. In the end she had prevailed, and that without betraying the real state of her mind. Her decision to visit her brother had been so hurriedly made and acted upon for her to write to him about it, and so she had telegraphed him from New York, and also a day later from Chicago, where her traveling friends had been delayed by illness. Nothing could have turned her back then. Madeline had planned to arrive in El Cajon on October 3rd, her brother's birthday, and she had succeeded, though her arrival occurred at the 24th hour. Her train had been several hours late. Whether or not the messages had reached Alfred's hand she had no means of telling, and the thing which concerned her now was the fact that she had arrived and he was not there to meet her. It did not take long for thought of the past to give way wholly to the reality of the present.
"I hope nothing has happened to Alfred," she said to herself. "He was well, doing splendidly the last time he wrote. To be sure, that was a good while ago, but then he never wrote often. Oh, he'll be all right. Pretty soon he'll come, and how glad I'll be. I wonder if he's changed."
As Madeline sat waiting at the yellow gloom, she heard the faint, intermediate click of the telegram instrument, the low hum of wires, and the occasional stamp of an iron-shod hoof, and a distinct laugh rising from the sounds of the dance. These commonplace things were new to her. She had become conscious of a slight quickening of her pulse. Madeline had only limited knowledge of the West. Like all of her class, she had traveled to Europe and had neglected America. A few letters from her brother had confused her already vague ideas of plains and mountains, as well as cowboys and cows. She had been astounded at the vast distance she had traveled, and if there had been anything attractive to look at in all the journey she had passed in the night. And here she sat, in a dingy little station, with telegraph wires moaning a lonely song in the wind. A faint song, like the rattling of thin chains, diverted Madeline's attention. At first she imagined it was made by the telegraph wires, and then she heard a step. The door swung wide, and a tall man entered, and with him came the clinking of a rattle. She realized that the sound had come from his spurs. The man was a cowboy, and his entrance recalled vividly to her that of Dustin Forlum in the first act of The Virginian.
"Would you please direct me to a hotel?" asked Madeline, rising.
The cowboy removed his sombrero, and the sweep he made with it, and the accompanying bow, despite their exaggeration, had kind of a rude grace. He took 2 long strides toward her. "Lady, are you married?" In the past, Miss Hammond's sense of humor had often helped her to overlook critical extractions natural to her breeding. She kept silent, and she imagined it was just as well that her veil hid her face at the moment. She had been prepared to find cowboys rather striking, and she had been warned not to laugh at them. This gentleman of the range deliberately reached down and took up her left hand. Before she recovered from her spark of amazement, he had stripped off her glove. "Fine spark, but no wedding ring," he drawled. "Lady, I'm glad to see you're not married." He released her hand and returned the glove. "You see, the only hotel here in town is against boarding married women."
"Indeed?"
said Madeline, trying to adjust her wits to the situation. "It sure is," he went on. "Bad business for hotels to have married women. It keeps the boys away. You see, this ain't Reno." Then he laughed rather boyishly, and from that and the way he slouched on his sombrero, Madeline realized he was half drunk. As she instinctively recoiled, she not only gave him a keener glance, but stepped into a position where a better light shone upon his face. It was like red bronze, bold and raw and sharp. He laughed again, as if good-naturedly amused with himself, and the laugh scarcely changed the hard set of his features. Like that of all women whose beauty and charm had brought them much before the world, Miss Hammond's intuition had been developed until she had a delicate and sensitive perception of the nature of men and her effect upon them. This crude cowboy, under the influence of drink, had affronted her. Nevertheless, whatever was in his mind, he meant no insult.
"I'd be greatly obliged if you'd show me to the hotel," she said.
"Lady, you wait here," he replied slowly, as if his thoughts did not come swiftly. "I'll go fetch the porter." She thanked him, and as he went out, closing the door, she sat down in considerable relief. It occurred to her that she should have mentioned her brother's name. And then she fell to wondering what living with such uncouth cowboys had done to Alfred. He had been wild enough in college, and she doubted that any cowboy could have taught him much. She alone of her family had ever believed in any latent good in Alfred Hammond, and her faith had scarcely survived the 2 years of silence. Waiting there, she again found herself listening to the moan of the wind through the wires. The horse outside began to pound with heavy hoofs, and once he whinnied. And then Madeline heard a rapid pattering, low at first, growing louder, which presently she recognized as the galloping of horses. She went to the window, thinking, hoping her brother had arrived. But as the clattering increased to a roar, shadows swept by, lean horses, flying manes and tails, sombreroed riders, all strange and wild in her sight. Recalling what the conductor had said, she was at some pains to quell her uneasiness. Dust clouds shrouded the dim lights in the windows, and then, out of the gloom, 2 figures appeared, one tall, the other slight, the cowboy returning with the porter. Heavy footsteps sounded without, and lighter ones dragged along, and then suddenly the door rasped open, jarring the whole room. The cowboy entered, pushing a disheveled figure, that of a priest, a padre whose mantle had manifestly been disarranged by a rude grasp of his captor. Plain it was that the padre was extremely terrified. Madeline Hammond gazed in bewilderment at the little man, so pale and shaken, and a protest trembled upon her lips, but it was never uttered, for this half-drunken cowboy now appeared to be a cool, grimming, smiling devil, and stretching out a long arm, he grasped her and swung her back to the bench. "You stay there," he ordered. His voice, though neither brutal nor harsh nor cruel, had the unaccountable effect of making her feel powerless to move. No man had ever addressed her before in such a tone. It was the woman in her that obeyed, not the personality of the proud Madeline Hammond. The padre lifted his clasped hands as if supplicating for his life, and began to speak hurriedly in Spanish. Madeline did not understand the language. The cowboy pulled out a huge gun and banished it in the priest's face, and then he lowered it, apparently to point it at the priest's feet. There was a red flash and a thundering report that stunned Madeline. The room filled with smoke and the smell of powder. Madeline did not faint or even shut her eyes, but she felt as if she was fast in a cold vice. When she could see discernibly again through the smoke, she experienced a sensation of immeasurable relief that the cowboy had not shot the padre, but he was still waving the gun, and now appeared to be dragging his victim towards her. What possibly could the drunken fool's intentions be? This must surely be a cowboy trick. She had a vague, sweeping, flashing recollection of Alfred's first letters describing the extravagant fun of the cowboys. Then she vividly remembered a moving picture she had seen, cowboys playing a monstrous joke on a lone schoolteacher. Madeline no sooner thought of that than she made certain her brother had introduced her to a little Wild West amusement. She could scarcely believe it, yet it must be true. Alfred's old love of teasing her might have extended even to this outrage. Possibly he was just standing outside the door or window laughing at her embarrassment. Anger checked her panic. She straightened up with what composure that surprised her had left her, and then she started for the door. But the cowboy barred her passage, grasping her arms. Then Madeline divined that her brother could not have any knowledge of this indignity. It was no trick. It was something that was happening, that was real, that threatened she knew not what. She tried to wrench free, feeling hot all over at being handled by this drunken brute. Poise, dignity, culture, all the acquired habits of character fled before the instinct to fight. She was athletic, and she fought. She struggled desperately, but he forced her back with hands of iron. She had never known a man could be so strong. And then it was the man's cool, smiling face, the paralyzing strangeness of his manner, more than his strength, that weakened Madeline until she sank trembling against the bench.
"What do you want?" she panted.
"Dearie, ease up a bit on the bridle," he replied gaily. Madeline thought she must be dreaming. She could not be thinking clearly. It had all been too swift, too terrible for her to grasp. Yet she not only saw this man, but also felt his powerful presence. And the shaking priest, the haze of blue smoke, the smell of powder, these were not unreal. Then close before her eyes burst another blinding red flash, and close at her ears bellowed another report. Unable to stand, Madeline slipped down upon the bench. Her drifting faculties refused clearly to record what transpires during the next few moments. Presently, however, in her mind steadied somewhat, she heard, though a dream, the voice of the padre hurrying over some strange words. It ceased, and then the cowboy's voice stirred her. "Lady, say si. Say it quick now." From sheer suggestion, a force irresistible at this moment when her will was clamped by panic, she spoke the word. "Now, lady, so we can finish this properly, what's your name?" Still obeying mechanically, she told him. He stared for a while, as if the name had awoken something in his mind. He leaned back unsteadily. Madeline heard the expulsion of his breath, kind of a hard puff, not unusual in drunken men. "What name?"
"Madeline Hammond. I'm Alfred Hammond's sister."
He put his hand up and brushed that imaginary something before his eyes. And then he loomed over her, and that hand, now shaking a little, reached out for her veil. Before he could touch it, however, she swept it back, revealing her face. "Your Majesty Hammond?" How strange was it to hear that name on the lips of this cowboy. It was a name by which she was familiarly known, though only those nearest and dearest to her had the privilege of using it. And now it revived her dulled faculties, and by effort she regained control of herself. "Your Majesty Hammond," he replied, and this time she affirmed wonderfully rather than questioningly. Madeline rose and faced him.
"Yes, I am."
He slammed his gun back in his holster. "Well, I reckon we won't go on with it then."
"With what, sir? And what did you force me to say si to this priest?"
"I reckon that was a way I took to show him you'd be willing to get married."
"Oh, you...
Words failed her. This appeared to galvanize the cowboy into action. He grasped the padre and led him towards the door, cursing and threatening, no doubt enjoying serenity. And then he pushed him across the threshold and stood there breathing hard and wrestling with himself. Wait here a minute, Miss Hammond," he said huskily. "You could fall into worse company than mine, though I reckon you'd surely think not. I'm pretty drunk, but I'm otherwise all right. Just wait here a minute." She stood quivering and blazing with rage, and watched this savage fight his drunkenness. And now he was battling with himself to hold upon it. Madeline saw the dark, damp hair lift from his brows as he held it up to the cool wind. Above him she saw the white stars and the deep blue sky, and they seemed so unreal to her as anything she'd ever seen before. They were cold, bright, aloft, distant, and looking at them, she felt her wrath lessen and die and leave her calm. The cowboy turned and began to talk. You see, I was pretty drunk," he labored. "There was a fiesta and a wedding, if you will. I do fool things when I'm drunk. I made a fool bet I'd marry the first girl who come to town. If you hadn't been wearing that veil, the fellers were joshing me, and Ed Linton was getting married, and everybody wanted to gamble I must have been pretty drunk. After the one look at her when she had first put aside her veil, he had not raised his eyes to her face. The cool audacity had vanished in what was either excessive emotion or the condition particular to men when drunk. He could not stand still. Perspiration collected in beads upon his forehead. He kept wiping his face with his scarf, and he was breathing like a man after a violent exertion. You see, I was pretty, he began.
Explanations are not necessary, she interrupted. I am very tired and distressed. The hour's late. Have you the slightest idea what it means to be a gentleman?
His bronzed face burned to a flaming crimson.
Is my brother here in town?
Madeline went on. No, he's at his ranch.
But I wired him.
Like as not, the message is over in his box at the P.O. He'll be in town tomorrow. He's shipping cattle for Stillwell.
I must go to the hotel. Would you please?
If he had heard her last words, he showed no evidence of it. A noise outside had attracted his attention. Madeline listened. Low voices of men, the softer, liquid tones of women, drifting in through the open door. Evidently, the speakers were approaching the station. Footsteps crunching in gravel attested to this, and quicker steps, coming with deep tones of men in anger, told of a quarrel. Then the woman's voice, hurried and broken, rising higher with a vain appeal. The cowboy's demeanor startled Madeline into anticipation of something dreadful, and she was not deceived. From outside came the sound of a scuffle, a muffled shot, a groan, the thud of a fallen body, a woman's low cry, and the footsteps padding away in rapid retreat. Madeline Hammond leaned weakly back in her chair, cold and sick, and for a moment her ears throbbed to the tamp of the dancers across the way and the rhythm of the cheap music. Then into the open door-place flashed a girl's tragic face, lighting by dark eyes and framed by dusky hair. The girl reached a slim brown hand round the side of the door and held on as if to support herself. A long black scarf accentuated her gaudy attire.
"Senor Jean,"
she exclaimed, and breathless, glad recognition made a sudden break in her terror. "Buena!" The cowboy leaped to her. "Girl, are you hurt?"
"No, senor."
He took hold of her. "I heard someone get shot. Was it Danny?"
"No, senor."
"Did Danny do the shooting? Tell me, girl."
"No."
"I'm sure glad. I thought Danny was mixed up in that. He had Stillwell's money for the boys. I was afraid. Say, Benita, but you'll get in trouble. Who was with you? What did you do?"
"Senor Jean, they Don Carlos Vaqueros. They quarrel over me. I only dance a little, smile a little, and they quarrel. I beg they be good. Watch out for Sheriff Haw. And now Sheriff Haw put me in jail. I'm so frightened. He tried make little love to Bonita once, and now he hates me like he hates Senor Jean."
"Pat Haw won't put you in jail. Take my horse and hit the trail. Bonita, promise to stay away from El Cajon."
"Si, senor."
He led her outside. Madeline heard the horse snort and champ his bit. The cowboy spoke low. Only a few words were audible. Stirrups, wait, out of town, mountain trail, now ride. A moment's silence ensued and was broken by a pounding of hoofs and a spattering of gravel. She caught a glimpse of the scarf being swept by the wind and hair and a little form down in the saddle. The horse was outlined in black against the line of stars. There was something wild and splendid in the horse's flight. Directly the cowboy appeared again in the doorway. Miss Hammond, I reckon we want to hustle out of here. Been bad goings on, and there's a train due." She hurried into the open air, not daring to look back on her either side. Her guides walked swiftly. She had almost run to keep up with them. Many conflicting emotions confused her. She had a strange sense of this big giant beside her, silent except for his jangling spurs. She had a strange feeling of cool, sweet wind and the white stars. Was that only her fancy, or did those wonderful stars open and shut? She had a queer thought of that somewhere in ages back, in another life, she had seen those stars. The night seemed dark, yet there was a pale light, a light from the stars, and she fancied it would always haunt her. Suddenly aware she was being led beyond the line of houses, she spoke.
"Where are you taking me?"
"Taking you to Florence Kingsley," he replied.
"Who's she?"
"I reckon she's your brother's best friend out here." Madeline kept pace with the cowboy for a few minutes longer, and then she stopped. It was as much from necessity to catch her breath as it was from fear. All at once she realized what little use her training had been for such an experience as this. The cowboy, missing her, came back in a few steps, and then he waited, still listening, looming beside her.
"It's so lonely and so dark. How do I know what warrant can you give me that no harm will befall me if I go any further?"
"None, Miss Hammond, except that I've seen your face." End of chapter 1.